The wind ripped across that lonely Nebraska prairie that night. Inside a dim, drafty farmhouse, Carson Hill held his newborn daughter, her tiny body trembling with every breath. 2 nights earlier, his wife, Hannah, had died during childbirth. No pain left for her, only silence. He buried her on their own land, with only a shovel and the cold wind for witnesses. It was just Carson, the crying baby, and a half-finished life. But as he stared out into the dark, rain pounding on the broken windows, something shattered the silence, a soft but urgent knock at the front door. Carson's heart stopped. Whoever stood there couldn't know what had already been broken, and yet everything was about to change. Before we dive deeper, tell us in the comments, have you ever felt completely alone, even surrounded by people? Where are you watching from? We'd love to hear your story. And if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Elias and Martha Carter had always believed that love was enough to build a life. In the small town of Red Hollow, Montana, their names carried warmth. People spoke of them as the couple who smiled even when the harvest failed, who danced under the barn lights long after everyone else had gone home. Their ranch wasn't much, just a stretch of land passed down from Elias's father. But to them, it was paradise. Every morning began with the smell of brewed coffee and the sound of cattle in the distance. Elias would head out before sunrise, and Martha would wave from the porch, her laughter soft as the morning wind. They wrote notes to each other, simple handwritten reminders like, "Don't forget to smile today," or "Dinner by the fire tonight." Those notes filled their kitchen walls, little pieces of love that made the rough days easier to bear. When Martha discovered she was expecting, it felt like the final piece of their dream had fallen into place. She'd always wanted a big family, a home filled with laughter and muddy boots by the door. But her pregnancy was hard. Some days she could barely stand without dizziness, and Elias would catch her when her legs wobbled, whispering, "You don't have to do this alone." Yet Martha, with her quiet determination, would always smile and say, "For our baby, I will." She painted the nursery in shades of sunflower yellow, humming softly as the light spilled through the window. Elias built a small cradle by hand, carving tiny stars into the headboard. At night, they'd sit by the fireplace, her head resting on his shoulder, dreaming of the life waiting just beyond the horizon. But dreams have fragile edges, and sometimes life tears through them without warning. The night of her labor came too soon. The sky outside was split by thunder, the wind howling like a wounded animal. Inside, Elias held her hand as she fought for breath, whispering prayers he could barely remember. Hours passed, and when dawn finally broke, only one heartbeat remained. The sound of that single cry, his daughter's first, cut through the silence like a blade. Martha was gone. Just like that, the warmth of their home faded into cold emptiness. Elias buried her beneath the old oak tree behind the ranch, the same tree where they'd carved their initials years ago. He stood there long after the rain had stopped, the baby's blanket clutched in his hands, his heart heavy with the kind of grief that leaves a man hollow. He was now a father, alone in a world that suddenly felt too wide, too quiet, and far too cruel. Days turned into weeks, and the silence in that cabin began to feel alive. Elias did everything he could to keep his daughter breathing, but every cry reminded him of what he had lost. The baby refused to drink the cow's milk he mixed, turning her tiny face away and wailing until exhaustion silenced her. Elias would pace the floorboards, whispering broken promises. "I'm trying, sweetheart, I'm trying." His hands shook when he held the bottle, and sometimes he'd just sit in the old rocking chair, staring at the empty space where Martha used to sit. The house felt colder now, as if even the fire had given up on warming it. Each night he'd light a single lantern, its flicker casting shadows across the walls, and the guilt would creep in. "I couldn't save her. I should have done something more." He said it so often that it became a prayer, a punishment, and a confession all in one. The townsfolk came by once or twice, neighbors dropping off bread or canned beans, their faces full of pity they didn't know how to hide. But Elias couldn't stand the look in their eyes. He'd thank them through the half-open door, then shut it quickly, locking himself inside his grief. Soon, they stopped coming altogether. Out there, miles from town, isolation settled over him like a second skin. The only sounds were the wind through the grass and his daughter's soft breathing beside him. But then strange things began to happen. At first it was small. The kerosene lantern would flicker for no reason, the flame pulsing as if to a rhythm only it could hear. Then, late one night, when exhaustion had finally pulled him toward sleep, Elias woke to the faint sound of a melody drifting through the air. It was coming from the nursery. He froze, every muscle tense. The tune was soft, slow, heartbreakingly familiar. Martha's lullaby, the one she sang every night before bed. He stood there in the dark, his breath shallow, eyes fixed on the crack of light under the nursery door. The rocking chair inside creaked once, then silence. Elias told himself it was just the wind, that grief plays tricks on tired minds. But deep down, he knew that melody too well to mistake it for imagination. Something or someone was still there, watching, listening, waiting. He didn't know it yet, but help, and a message from beyond, were already on their way. The storm came back heavier that night, slamming against the windows and howling through every crack in the walls. Elias sat on the floor beside the cradle, his daughter's cries cutting through him like shards of glass. He had tried everything: warm milk, soft humming, even wrapping her in Martha's old shawl, but nothing worked. His voice trembled as he whispered, "Please, baby, please stop crying. I don't know what else to do." The fire had burned low, and the shadows stretched long across the room. Elias sank to his knees, exhaustion pressing on his chest, tears he hadn't let himself cry now spilling freely. Then, over the roar of the storm, came a sound that didn't belong. 3 soft knocks at the door. He froze, thinking he'd imagined it. Then again, 1, 2, 3. Slow, deliberate. He stood up, heart pounding, clutching the old rifle that leaned against the wall. Nobody should have been out here. Not in this weather, not at this hour. When he opened the door, wind and rain rushed in, soaking the wooden floor. Standing there in the downpour was a woman, her face pale but kind, her coat drenched, and in her arms a bottle of milk and a folded blanket. "I'm sorry to bother you," she said, her voice shaking but gentle. "I heard crying, and I thought someone might need help." Elias stared at her, confused. "Heard crying?" he repeated. "From where?" She hesitated before answering. "From the road." But Elias knew the nearest road was nearly 2 miles away. And through a storm like this? Impossible. Still, the baby's wails filled the room behind him, and his heart warred between suspicion and desperate hope. The woman stepped forward slightly, lowering her voice. "My name's Clara Thompson. I'm a nurse, just moved to a small cabin east of here. I lost my husband in the war." Her eyes flickered to the cradle. "When I heard the crying, I couldn't just walk away." For a long moment neither of them spoke. Rain dripped from her hair, the cold bit through the air between them. Finally, Elias nodded slowly, stepping aside. "Come in," he murmured. Clara entered quietly, setting the bottle by the fire to warm. The baby's crying softened, as if sensing something had changed. Elias watched her carefully, unsure what to make of this stranger who had appeared in the middle of nowhere. But one question lingered in his mind, echoing louder than the storm outside. How could she have heard a baby's cry through a storm that silenced even the wind? Clara's hands moved with quiet confidence as she lifted the baby into her arms. The infant, who had fought every bottle Elias tried to give, took the warm milk eagerly now, her tiny fingers curling around Clara's thumb. Elias watched in disbelief, his rough, work-worn hands hanging uselessly at his sides. Clara smiled gently. "She just needed a little warmth," she said softly, rocking the child with an instinct born of loss and love. For the first time in weeks, the cabin filled with something other than grief, a fragile calm, like the first light after a long storm. From that night on, Clara began visiting every day. She said it was only to help a neighbor in need, but her presence soon became the thread that stitched Elias's days together. She brought fresh milk, warm bread, sometimes even stories from town. Grace, that's what Elias decided to name his daughter, started to thrive under her care. Her cheeks filled out, her cries softened, and her laughter came often, light and sweet. Slowly, warmth crept back into the walls of that lonely house. Elias found himself doing things he hadn't done since Martha's passing: fixing the broken porch steps, lighting the fire before sundown, sharing supper at the table instead of eating alone by the window. Clara would hum while washing the dishes, and Grace would coo in her cradle nearby. On some evenings, Elias would catch himself smiling, surprised by the sound of laughter returning to his home, and when he looked at Clara, he saw the same gentleness that Martha once carried, that quiet strength that held a family together. One evening, as the sun sank low behind the hills, Clara told her story. She spoke of her husband, a medic who died in the Korean War, and the child she lost a few months later. Her voice trembled, but there was peace in her eyes. "When you lose someone you love," she said, "the world stops making sense for a while. But somehow, life still expects you to go on." Elias listened, his heart heavy with understanding. He didn't have to say a word. His silence was enough to tell her he knew that kind of pain too. Days turned to weeks, and soon Clara felt less like a visitor and more like a part of that home. Grace adored her. Elias began to notice things: how her laughter filled the empty spaces, how her presence made the nights seem shorter. The loneliness that once haunted him started to fade, replaced by something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. But beneath Clara's kindness, there was something she hadn't spoken aloud, a truth she carried quietly, like a burden too heavy to share. She had not come to that ranch by chance. There was another reason she'd found her way through that storm, a reason that would soon change everything, because what Clara never told Elias was the real reason she came to that ranch. It was a quiet afternoon when the wind outside finally rested and sunlight filtered softly through the nursery window. Clara was tidying the small room, folding tiny blankets and humming the lullaby she'd come to sing for Grace, the same tune Elias once said Martha loved. As she lifted the baby's pillow to straighten the sheets, something caught her eye. A small, yellowed envelope lay tucked beneath it, edges worn and delicate, as if it had been waiting there for someone to find. Her hand stilled. The front of the envelope bore only one name, written in looping, careful handwriting: Elias. Clara hesitated before calling him. "Elias, there's something you need to see." He came in quietly, wiping his hands on his jeans, his brow furrowed. When he saw the envelope, color drained from his face. He recognized that handwriting instantly. It was Martha's. The same familiar script that once filled their kitchen walls with love notes and reminders. His fingers trembled as he took it from Clara, staring at it as if afraid it might vanish. The seal was still intact. Slowly he tore it open. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded neatly. The ink had faded a little, but every word was clear. Elias read aloud, his voice breaking, "If you're reading this, I'm gone. But know this, someone will come. Someone sent by Grace. Trust her, Elias. She will help you find your way again, and through her, our child will live the life we dreamed for her." The room fell silent. Only Grace's soft cooing filled the air. Elias sank onto the edge of the bed, the letter trembling in his hands, tears tracing down his face. "She wrote this before she died," he whispered, his voice barely holding steady. Clara stood frozen, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Dated a week before she passed," Elias murmured, reading the corner of the page. How could she have known?" Clara's breath caught. The fire flickered in the hearth, its glow catching on the edge of the letter. She felt something stir deep inside, a quiet awe, a shiver that wasn't from the cold. "Maybe she didn't know," Clara said softly. "Maybe she just believed." Elias looked up at her, his eyes full of wonder and grief and something else. Acceptance. He pressed the letter to his chest, whispering Martha's name like a prayer. For the first time since her death, his tears weren't only from sorrow. But even as the moment settled into stillness, one question lingered between them like an unfinished thought. Was it faith that led Clara to that door on that stormy night, or something far greater than either of them could understand? That night, sleep wouldn't come. Elias sat by the dying fire, the letter from Martha resting on the table beside him. He had read it a dozen times, tracing every word with his thumb, searching for meaning, or for reason. But the more he stared at it, the more questions clawed at his mind. How could Martha have known Clara's name before she ever arrived? How could she have predicted someone would come through the storm? Doubt, that cruel and quiet thing, began to creep in. What if it wasn't real, he thought. What if Clara forged it? The idea felt like betrayal just to think, but grief makes a man see ghosts where there are none. By the end of the week, whispers started circulating through Red Hollow. Word travels fast in small towns. The men at the feed store muttered that the nurse had moved in too quickly, that she was after the Carter land, that Elias had gone soft. Others said darker things, that Clara had bewitched him, that no stranger would wander miles through a storm without reason. Each rumor reached Elias like a stone thrown against glass. He didn't confront Clara at first, but she could feel the distance growing between them, the quiet stares, the half-finished sentences. One evening, when the sky hung heavy with rain again, she stood at the doorway with her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders. Her voice trembled as she said, "If you can't trust me, Elias, I shouldn't stay." He didn't stop her. The words wouldn't come. He only watched as she walked down the muddy path, her figure fading into the storm. The sound of the door closing behind her echoed through the empty house like finality. For days, silence returned to the ranch, the kind that pressed against his chest and made every breath feel heavier. The chair where Clara used to sit stayed empty. The baby's bottle, still half full from that last night, sat untouched on the counter. Even Grace seemed quieter, her laughter replaced with uneasy fussing, as if she too felt the absence. One sleepless night, Elias opened Martha's old chest, where she kept her journals, her thoughts scribbled in careful handwriting. He flipped through the pages, hoping for comfort, but what he found made his hands tremble. One entry caught his eye, dated just weeks before she passed. "I've been dreaming of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle heart. She stands by our child's cradle when I cannot. Her name, Clara. I don't know how I know it, but I trust it." Elias read the passage again and again, his heart pounding. It was all there. The name, the promise, the faith. The doubts that had poisoned his mind began to crumble, replaced by something far more powerful. He felt Martha's presence in those words, not haunting him, but guiding him. As the wind howled outside, Elias whispered to the empty room, "You were right, Martha. She was sent by grace." He looked toward the window, where the rain traced slow rivers down the glass, and a quiet realization washed over him. Sometimes love doesn't return the way we expect, not in the faces we remember or the voices we've lost, but in the form we need most, at the moment we are most broken. Elias didn't wait for the rain to stop. The truth burned too strong inside him to sit another moment in that empty house. He saddled his old mare and rode through the night, the wind cutting against his face, the letter from Martha tucked safely inside his coat. Each hoofbeat echoed like a heartbeat, pushing him forward through the dark. The storm had thinned to a gentle drizzle by the time he reached the old chapel on the edge of town, a small wooden building most folks had long forgotten. Through the cracked door he saw a faint glow flickering inside. Clara was there, kneeling before the altar, her shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her face lit by the trembling light of 2 candles. One burned for her husband, the man she'd lost to war. The other, she whispered softly, was for Martha. Elias stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching the woman who had carried so much pain and still found the strength to bring light to others. His throat tightened as he stepped inside. The floor creaked beneath his boots, and Clara turned, her eyes wide with surprise. "I didn't know if you'd come," she said quietly, her voice barely louder than the flame. Elias shook his head, rainwater dripping from his hat. "I should have never let you walk away." He reached into his coat, holding out Martha's letter, its paper creased and worn. "You didn't replace her," he said, his voice steady now. "You answered her prayer." Clara's lips parted, trembling as she took the letter, her eyes glistening in the candlelight. For a moment neither spoke. The silence between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full, sacred, like something unseen had settled there with them. Elias reached for her hand, and she didn't pull away. When they returned to the ranch the next morning, the clouds were breaking, and sunlight poured across the fields for the first time in weeks. The house, once heavy with loss, began to feel alive again. Clara stayed, not as a visitor, but as someone who belonged. Grace, bright-eyed and growing stronger every day, reached for her often, her laughter filling every corner of the home. Time moved gently after that. The porch Elias had rebuilt became their place of peace, where Clara would sit with Grace, teaching her to walk barefoot through the grass, and Elias would watch from the steps, a quiet smile finally returning to his face. He named his daughter Grace Clara Carter, a promise that neither the past nor the pain would be forgotten, only transformed. And so, life found its rhythm again. Not perfect, not free of sorrow, but full. The kind of fullness that only comes when love returns in a form you never expected, but exactly when you need it most. They say love never dies. Maybe that's true, because somewhere between grief and grace, 2 broken souls found what loss could never take: the courage to begin again. Time softened the edges of pain on that small Montana ranch. The mornings that once began with silence now echoed with laughter, Grace's tiny feet pattering against the floor, Clara's voice humming a tune once sung by Martha herself. The wind carried peace across the fields again, bending the tall grass in gentle waves, whispering the kind of calm that only comes after the storm. Elias would sometimes stand by the oak tree where Martha rested, holding his daughter close, and he'd smile, not in sadness, but in gratitude. He knew then that love hadn't left him. It had simply changed its form, finding new hands, a new voice, a new beginning. And maybe that's what grace really is. The quiet way the universe reminds us that even in the ruins of what we've lost, something beautiful can still grow. The pain, the tears, the nights of doubt, all of it had led him here, to this fragile but honest peace. Love hadn't ended when Martha's heart stopped beating. It had carried on through Clara, through Grace, through every sunrise that bathed their little ranch in gold. Would you call it fate or faith? Let us know what you believe in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, please like this video. It helps us share stories that remind the world what kindness still means.